by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSides Cincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSidesCincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSidesCincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS, Encore Technologies, Morphic. Join the conversation. Tweet us at BSidesCincy. The stream will begin shortly. BSides Cincinnati 2016 is sponsored by GE Aviation, Ashland, CBTS.
He's cracking the whip.
Yeah.
Hang on.
Yeah, I know. I know.
He's cracking the snapper. What do you call that?
I don't know. The clapboard. I think that's officially what it's called, is like a clapboard, the one they use in the movies, right?
Clapboard.
Yeah. Am I good? Do I need to stand near you, or?
No, I think you're good.
Okay.
I think this still picks me up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not that it even matters. Hey, everybody. I would like to welcome to the stage a man who needs no introduction. If you checked your speakers list, you probably thought that like a supervillain was going to come talk from like a DC or Marvel comic. But this is Coleman Kane. He knows all about threats and RE, and he's going to share some info with us. So everybody welcome Mr. Coleman Kane.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony, and thank all of you for coming out. We've had some really great speakers today, so this is the third one of these we've done, and it has been extremely fun to be involved in all the ones we've done so far. So, anyhow, without further ado, I'm going to talk about malware analysis on a budget. So I'll dive in a little bit about me, and I'm going to go off slide a bit here. In fun, it's kind of a little bit off the screen, but that's okay. I'm currently the Cyber Intelligence Program Manager at GE Aviation in their Security Operations Department. In joining this role, I initially got started in the malware analysis space. So I was brought in as a reverse engineer. That happened to be in the cyber intelligence team, and I gradually, over the course of the time that I've been there, started to chip off more and more pieces of the intelligence program to build kind of an integrated one there. I'm also currently a PhD candidate over in the computer science engineering area. So if you saw Mark's talk earlier, he kind of discussed a lot of the distinctions between the computer science versus IT, stuff like that. If you have any questions about the computer science stuff, please feel free to ask me as well. We actually have a NSA certification for cyber operations over there, and so I'm actually taking courses out of that program to graduate with a cyber operations certificate when I get out. I did graduate from UC as well with a BS in computer engineering. My dad was also a professor here, which means that I pretty much grew up on this campus my entire life. I'm a CRITS project contributor, so if you remember Nate Hausrath gave that great talk earlier about the intelligence program. He talked a lot about CRITS. So CRITS is also something that's near and dear to my heart. We use it heavily within our program as well. And so I threw that on here. I've been a FreeBSD community member for quite some time. And then I really only have 6 years of experience in IT security. Getting into the security space is a relatively new thing for me. Comparatively, however, I've had, prior to that, I did have a large amount of CS and IT experience. Grew up in Cincinnati. I like to run. I recently did the half marathon flying pig, mainly because I like eating sugary things like cake and stuff like that, so it helps with that. I have a 6-year-old daughter, ducked out earlier. She had a ballet recital today because life always ends up to conflict with itself. And then, of course, like many of the other Cincinnati InfoSec folk, I fancy cats for some reason. So, yes. I also fancy memes, and you'll get that out of my presentation as well. So if you don't get information out of it, at least hopefully you'll get a laugh. So the reason I put this one together, as I said, I put together a malware analysis program at GE is kind of one of my first steps at GE Aviation. And so I have a lot of experience with a lot of the tools that the community has used in analyzing malware and everything like that. So I kind of wanted to share a lot of the knowledge and expertise that I gained throughout that time in analyzing a lot of different, a lot of different attacks, a lot of different malware, stuff like that. I know a lot of shops out there tend to not have as big of a budget for security work as, say, GE does. And I wanted to try and share a lot of the knowledge that we've gained over the years in using free tools and the open source community and a lot of the, sharing community that's out there to basically put together a malware analysis program, as I said, on a budget. So I kind of put, this up here as like, go find evil is kind of your first, your first directive from security. That was kind of ours too, is go find evil. We're told that we need to go and secure everything. And I know that's becoming a lot more popular mode of operation lately with a lot of the breaches going on. So first, they hire a bunch of people, bring them in and say, go find evil. And then you say, okay, well, I'm going to need all this capability and everything like that. And they say, okay, great. We'll fund that capability for you. Here's what you get. So, and that's kind of the, the classic problem that's been shared with me from a lot of my peers in the industry is chronic, I would say, just a difficulty finding funding for it. It's a very expensive problem because it's a very hard problem. So what I like to do is I try and, define, say, what malware is so that I have a nice, one-liner that I can give to, say, leadership and that type of thing. And so I put it up here. Very good place to begin is to define what is considered to be malware. I usually break this up into two categories. So I've got artifacts that are designed to be used for malicious purposes. So attack tools, exploits. So you'll see a lot of the things that say that you're supposed to build with Metasploit, stuff like that. Those are things that I tend to consider to be, say, malicious intent artifacts. And then there are also other ones that are designed for legitimate use that are also sometimes used for malicious attacks. And in these cases, you might see tools such as, ping, for instance, or run DLL32, or things like that that attackers will run when they're in your environment. But either you gave them to your, you gave them to the attackers because they're already installed in the systems, or attackers may just have a nice suite of tools, say like the Windows sysinternal suite or something like that, that might be useful to them for whatever reason when they do get into your network. The reason I do divide up these two categories like this is because category one tends to be things that you can build really good signatures to upon analyzing them to try and identify the unique characteristics of those within your environment to find the attack tools. Versus the other ones that when you're doing an investigation, you may come across some tool that, say, initially you don't know what it is, but later on you find out what it is, and you determine that that tool is actually, say, a public use tool, that type of thing. Being able to categorize these things ahead of time when you're analyzing an incident is really, really helpful And I figured I'd just throw it up here as kind of like an initial point to consider. For the rest of my talk, I'm mainly going to be discussing tools that we use to focus on that category 1 set of malware. So why do malware analysis? So I like to look at it as a as a constant arms race between the cybersecurity industry and malware authors. So if you're a user who's getting hit by cyber attacks and you have a pretty decent defense team, but you're also working on stuff that's very, say, valuable to the adversary, when the adversary attacks you and they fail to, say, get in once, they're typically not going to stop there. They're not going to say, oh, hey, GE's got their shit together, let's go, harass Ashland or something, right? They're not going to do that. They still want what we have. They're just going to try harder to get in. So, for instance, they're going to keep phishing phishing your users over and over again with slightly more sophisticated or slightly more creative things. So, malware analysis ends up not necessarily being a solution or a box you can get off the shelf in our experience. It ends up being more of a program, more of a team of people working together, team of analysts working together, analyzing malware, using, say, tools that they've built or tools that they've bought, refining these tools to chase the changing threat that's coming to them from the outside and even sometimes from the inside. So because of that, in my experience, I found tools that you can actually refine over time. A lot of the open source tools end up being extremely valuable, parts of our program. And that's probably like the core contingent of our malware analysis program today is the open source tools that we've gotten from the community that have a lot of community input that are constantly being changed over time, and also that we can change within our environment ourselves to chase the attacks that we're seeing are directed at us and may even be very specific to us. So what I usually do is I try and look at it also from the point of what am I trying to get out of malware analysis. Some of you that may have like a computer science or computer engineering background may know that diving into a program to try and try and understand the program can actually be a very time-intensive, very involved task. You could get a program that you got from, say, an attack from a phish that's supposed to be a backdoor that you've never seen before. You could probably spend 2 months, every day, 8 hours, 2 months, trying to analyze this thing to understand every single feature it has, every single thing that it can do, every possible risk that it has, and maybe you'll cover like 10% of the actual code that's in the program. It's just that intensive, that difficult of a problem. So what we try and do is we try and focus on collecting a lot of the artifacts and automating a lot of the artifact analysis that will help us identify, say, this particular backdoor that we just saw. How does it differ from, say, other malware that we've collected up to now, but also how does it differ from all the other programs that are in our environment? We also try and build detection around, we build analysis work around the detection capability that we have. And when I say that, what I mean is we look at the monitors that we have running on our hosts, we look at the monitors that we have running on our network sensors, we try and see, say, what they actually have visibility on. And then we only try and focus on getting those data points out of the malware samples. So a great example is if, if a malware sample is intended to be interacted with over a network connection by, say, an attacker, and it has a lot of, say, status messages and things like that, if it's communicating in plain text, then detecting those status messages as messages sent over the network wire, that would be valuable information. Especially if I know that I have network sensors that can pick that stuff up. But if I'm trying to look for all programs on my network that can allow an operator to upload and download files, remotely execute files, things like that, if I'm documenting all of that stuff in a malware report or something like that, I can't exactly put together a detection system for that if I don't have some magic tool that can go to all EXEs on my network and tell me what all features they have, right? So identifying what information you can extract from analyzing a malware sample, and especially what information is probably most critical in deploying to individual tools that can actually do the monitoring and then tell you what the malicious activity is or tell you what's present on the wire. That type of thing is what we try and drive a lot of our analysts to do, or I should say to focus on. So this is, a lot of this stuff is kind of my pitch on, say, making sure that the work that people put into doing the malware analysis ends up being, say, most beneficial, most productive to what you're doing. Because if you spend, say, 8 hours analyzing a sample and getting a large amount of information that you can't turn into an alert, then that's 8 hours that you could have spent looking at another malware sample and actually getting information maybe that you can turn into an alert. So diving into malware analysis, I carve the analysis work into two camps, or into two parts, basically. One of them is what I call dynamic or runtime analysis. So if we're looking at malware as malicious code, as a malicious program, when that program is run on your system or when that file is opened up on your computer, does it make any changes to the underlying system? Does it leave any footprints indicating that it has been run on the system? Does it write files to disk? Does it install some sort of persistence, as was mentioned earlier? So does it set it up so that when you boot the computer, there is a configuration in the registry that causes it to start up when your computer boots every time? Things like that. So basically, is there some way that you could look at a system without, say, focusing in on a specific file and determine if that system happens to be infected with this particular piece of malware? So that's one very, very beneficial piece of malware analysis. And then another one is what I call static analysis. And so that's when the malware is not executing, but you do have a copy, like in your possession of a file that you don't know. Can you extract characteristics from, say, known malware files that can help inform you as to whether this thing you're looking at now is part of, say, some malware sample you've seen before, or even can you extract new things from it to identify if there are any other copies of this thing that you have now in your environment, if, say, you can look at all files that are on all systems in your environment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into what amounts to a survey of, a lot of tools that we've used, and I've been given some input from some of my colleagues about tools that they found helpful as well, that basically can assist with both of these categories. So the slide deck, which will be available on the internet as well, is really going to be, if you don't have a malware analysis program or you're trying to get into malware analysis, there's a lot of tools that would be very helpful and pretty much relatively easy to get and easy to install on a system. So, but also, the first thing that I will do, and this is always fun, is trip to Micro Center, right? So if you're going to go and analyze malware, you want to go and install the software. Number one, I don't analyze malware on this desktop much at all. It's useful, especially if I want to do an analysis that takes like 2 hours or something to run, to actually have another system to do that on. Also for safety reasons, right? Like I could accidentally self-pwn, myself on my laptop, even though it's running Linux, like that does happen. And I don't necessarily want to open myself up to that risk. So, what I did was I actually took a shopping trip last month to Micro Center because I just basically wanted to say like, hey, what kind of system could I cobble together for, a really cheap price there? So I managed to put this configuration together and then threw the entire thing together in about a half hour or something like that. But basically for $400, I was able to get 8-core, decently fast processor, 32 gigs RAM, which is always beneficial if you're going to do a lot of analysis work. More RAM means more data can be loaded into memory for the analysis, which means faster analysis. A really cheap motherboard that comes with onboard NIC, onboard video, really cheap case with power, and then enormous hard drive. Well, maybe not so enormous anymore, but it seemed pretty enormous to me at the time. Put Ubuntu 16.04 on it, and off to the races I was running. So your mileage may vary on this, but I still contend you can get decently cheap hardware for 400 bucks that you can throw together. I would recommend, if you are going to put together like a malware analysis lab or something, do something like this or find some cheap machine. The most critical thing is that you want to get a processor for it that can handle virtual machines. So, like was mentioned earlier with the cuckoo stuff, and we'll dive right into that. So, for dynamic analysis, a really popular system to use nowadays is Cuckoo Sandbox. It's been around or really mature since like maybe about 2012 or so. Kind of how I look at it, and I give like 3 layers right here of kind of my recommended setup. Like, if you want to create a virtual machine environment for yourself, I'd recommend looking into all 3 of these things and installing all of them. So VirtualBox ends up being the hypervisor system, which, for lack of a better term, is the software that allows you to construct virtual machines. So that's a thing that actually has the virtual disks, the virtual devices, all that stuff, and the integration with your operating system. Oracle VirtualBox has a really nice command line interface, also has a really nice GUI, and is pretty fast. There's also VMware out there. I don't use it that much, but other people say it's great too. So, your mileage may vary on it. I think Cuckoo, the way I would describe it is basically a inspection service for primarily geared towards VirtualBox, but I believe that it actually works with a number of different hypervisor systems. So while you're running your operating system inside a VirtualBox, you install Cuckoo Sandbox tools that will watch everything going on inside of that, inside of that virtual machine, inside of that operating system, and it'll keep logs of everything. And then it also comes with the management interface that can look at all these logs and then give you pretty reports like what Nate showed you earlier. And then finally, VMCloak is a tool that I recently became familiar with. It's also free, and it provides a helpful framework for automating work around creating sandbox VM images. So Nate's talk earlier, he talked about 1 VM is great, 10 VMs is even better, right? So, and we'll dive into this later, but you don't just get malware in the form of Windows EXEs. You'll get Windows EXEs, you'll get Linux programs, you'll get PDF documents that have EXEs buried in them, you'll get all sorts of Office documents that have exploits, things like that. So as you start to build all these out, you can see that there are multiple different versions of PDF Reader, multiple versions of different Office, stuff like that. You can't install all these on single virtual machines. So a tool like VMCloak can help you manage a large, varied configuration across many different virtual machines. And automate the installation and maintenance of software around it. So these 3 are probably worth looking into if you want to create a VM lab for yourselves. So the other nice thing about VirtualBox, as I said, others offer this type of stuff too, but out of the box it can offer RDP and VNC options. So even though this might be a box that's sitting like in your basement or in your closet or something like that, you can remote into it and you can still get a nice desktop. So and if anybody has like any comments or questions or anything like that while I'm going through some of this, feel free to raise your hands. I will not pretend that this is going to be a comprehensive list of all tools to do this stuff. It's more just tools that I have some familiarity with and I felt were pretty good for getting the job done. So one of the key things that I learned early on when we were trying to build a similar system for my employer was that how you configure the virtual machines is also very important. So when I install Windows, typically Windows comes up with what I'd say is an average security posture when you install it out of the box. There's a number of checkboxes you can turn off to make it more secure. And there's a number of checkboxes you can turn off to make it less secure. One of the things that I've liked to do for a lot of our VM configurations has turned all the checkboxes off that make it less secure. So basically try and build the most insecure VM possible. Go and get a book on securing your Windows network or whatever and do the opposite of everything that it tells you, right? So the reason why I like to do that is that when I get a piece of malware, I don't want to know how is this going to run in the hypothetically correct environment that my users are supposed to be using. I want to know how is this thing going to run on those 2 user systems that are like over in France somewhere or wherever, who happen to turn off all the checkboxes on there because they're frustrated because all those checkboxes prevent them from installing like the music app they like to listen to or something like that. And because that's the reality of the world I live in, I don't live in the world where the gold image that we install on all of our work laptops stays pristine for the entire life of that work laptop. I live in the reality, which is users will reduce the security posture of their environment in order to make life easier for themselves. So because of that, I want the VM to be most likely to be compromised so that it can document all those behaviors I mentioned earlier that you want to get out of the malware sample. So there's a lot of documentation on the internet about doing this. If you're trying to set this up, I'd recommend going on the internet, looking up information on how to build an insecure Windows environment, especially an insecure Windows environment tailored for, say, malware analysis, that type of thing. Another key thing that I'll add, just jumping back up here, is when you're installing a lot of these things like Cuckoo Sandbox and VM Cloak and things like that, I've found not only is it helpful to follow the installation instructions from the community that puts these together, so cuckoosandbox.org's documentation, but also read and follow documentation put up there by security researchers who aren't affiliated with those communities at all. Because those are the people who typically are going to document all the failure points and the hurdles and the things that, say, you missed when you were trying to set them up that are confusing you. That the documentation just happens to gloss over because it was written by people who are familiar with installing this thing constantly and very familiar with it from a development standpoint. So, working off of someone else's script who's not affiliated with that project is very helpful as well for highlighting some of the gotchas you'll run into. So another one, and I'd recommend installing this on some of the VMs that you have, are debuggers. So these are when you want to analyze a program that's running on the system, you may actually want to run it in a controlled environment where you're trying to be able to start and stop the program, so pause execution when you need to, actually edit the memory while it's running, that type of stuff, and even analyze the code. That's in memory while it's executing. So these are some really good debuggers that are very popular in the reverse engineering crowd. The lower one, OllyDebug, has a really long history that goes back to like 2003 or something. It's actually not really maintained anymore, as far as I can tell. Immunity Debugger is a newer one that's popular. It just doesn't have this huge built-up history of documentation about it. So you'll find that becomes a really common thing, is that the most documented tools are also the oldest ones, and in some cases the lesser used ones, or I should say the lesser maintained ones, because, say, the author got tired of maintaining them. And then the newer tools that have a lot more features tend to be the ones that don't have as much documentation around them. So static analysis. So we're going to jump over to the static analysis side. And to be totally honest, a lot of the work that I do is spent in the static analysis space. A lot of times I'm analyzing software, and a lot of our hunting program at work is built around looking for software, or I should say malware, that does not happen to be running on the system. Either it's in transit, we're analyzing it in transit, or we're trying to find stuff that may be latent on a system, might be dormant for quite some time, and we want to find it before it turns on. So I break it up into these 5 different categories here. Again, this is my own personal opinion here. It's not meant to be all-encompassing. There's probably some category of static analyzers that I use that I left out of here. There's a lot of tools for doing this work, so it's easy to get missed. But these are the ones that these are the categories that I'm going to cover later on. So the first one is scanners. So you want to scan your laptop for malware. So I think this one came back clean. So some scanners that you may probably all familiar with are the signature-based antivirus systems such as Sophos, Symantec, McAfee, stuff like that. In many cases, these maintain a database of virus definitions. They maintain a signature database. They're typically mapped to a lot of those virus IDs that you saw on the virus total slide earlier. And basically what they're looking for is they're opening up files. They're trying to see if some bytes happen to be in a file, and if they happen to be in the file, then they're going to say, yes, I've identified a piece of malware here. So in most of the cases, you can't add new information to the database yourself. Most of the malware vendors, what they do, especially with the kind of more enterprise level deployments is they'll actually have programs set up where you can submit a sample that you believe is malware to the vendor, and then they'll actually drop it into their queue and analyze it, and at some point in the future, that will become a new virus definition. But you don't actually get to see the work, you don't actually get to see the output from that, and you don't actually get to know why. This actually kind of leads into why we do have that problem, as Nate showed, which is you have Keybase up there, and you have all these antivirus vendors that identify it as a completely different thing with completely different names, and in some cases, like the Dark Comet one, was just completely a laughable conclusion. So one of the scanners that we use heavily in the malware analysis space is Victor Alvarez Yara project. So he started this way back in 2006 or something, and then more recently, like I think around 2010 or 2011, he actually got picked up by Google when they bought the VirusTotal program. So that VirusTotal program you saw earlier is actually a Google project now. So it's run by Google, and he works for them, working full time on this and also on some of the back end pieces of VirusTotal. So VirusTotal, actually, the intelligence side of it has a lot of features that are integrated well with this project, and I would recommend learning this thing inside and out. There's a lot of public rules on the internet, so it's kind of like community-driven malware detection, and it's really an attempt by the community to try and get a lot better about categorizing threats. So get a lot better than, say, your AV signatures out there, which to some extent are largely very vendor-driven, and their, Symantec, Sophos, McAfee, really their metric is it bad or not? And then they also give you a signature name, because that helps them kind of work it back on their side to say, possibly related things or whatever. But they have all their own database definitions and organizational structures that are proprietary within each one of them, and they're not necessarily compelled to share those amongst one another, and that's why you have that huge divergence in malware signature names and even like a lack of overlap. So this is kind of open, community-driven system to show you that stuff, and you can actually go into any one of these things. I think this is a rules repository, this is another rules repository. This is actually a tool that's a quick and dirty tool that's basically list all the things that I could turn into a signature from a file and then auto turn them into a signature. So it's like the shotgun approach to Yara rule generation. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples really quick of what Yara rules look like, just to kind of give you an idea of the power that it offers. So in this case, what you see, there's a huge metadata section, and basically what these are is just metadata that would be picked up by the Yara program and possibly could be queried by, say, secondary integration if you want to integrate Yara with some other larger tool. And then the strings. Strings is actually where the intelligence lives. So that is, I analyzed a file, and actually in this case it's somebody analyzed 3 files and found that these strings, so this text actually exists within those files as significant information of some sort, or unique information possibly. In addition to those strings, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, it has shorthand for putting together binary strings, basically. So rather than having to use your language escape sequences for building binary strings, it actually provides a shorthand for that. And it gives you the ability to use wildcards and patterns for different pieces of the binary code. So in this case, for instance, it's saying that it has to be something that is these 6 bytes right here, followed by anything, but then only if it's followed by this 8th byte right here. So 8 bytes, where the second byte can be anything, but the rest of them have to be these 7 that you see here. So it gives you the ability to wildcard like that. They actually have really good documentation on the Yara project website here that goes into detail on a lot more of the complex pattern building that you can do. I'm not going to go in. This isn't going to be a presentation on how to write Yara rules. I could probably talk 4 hours about that. I could probably argue with Nick Hoffman about it for 5. So, who's also around here somewhere, and he's a great person to talk to on this subject. So, Here's another one, and I pulled this one in just because I also wanted to show you one of the other powerful things that it has, but with great power comes great responsibility, and that's regular expressions. And the reason why I say comes great responsibility is regular expressions, if you're not familiar with them, I recommend you get familiar with them. So you look up regex, R-E-G-E-X, like I have up there on the header, or just regular expression. In particular, the variant that they're using here is what's called Perl-compatible regular expressions. And so Perl is the language that got slammed earlier. As a former Perl programmer, I also agree that Perl sucks. It sucks to maintain. But again, I know a lot of languages. I recommend learning Perl anyways. But Python uses the Perl-compatible regular expressions. Ruby uses the Perl-compatible regular expressions. So that's one of Perl's greatest contributions to the, to the software industry is that its regular expression form became like the de facto standard in all these tools. And that's because there are a lot of different regular expression libraries out there. Perl happened to build one that was extremely powerful for its time, and it has been extended since then. So in addition to that, when you're listing all this intel here, you aren't just listing like files that contain all these things or match on files that contain one of these things. You can actually do really complex, like this one needs to exist within a certain section of the file or a certain range within the file, or this one, this A.class, needs to occur within 10 bytes of B.class. You can do these really complicated conditionals that I list down here. And again, that language is extremely verbose and extremely powerful. I'm not going to go into all sorts of different examples about it, but it's very well documented in their documentation. So as you're collecting malware, over time you're analyzing it, it's very important to also try and build scanners, Yara scanners, that try and detect these malware samples that you're looking at so that you can help yourself identify things that may be related to an attack that you're dealing with investigating today. Because this gives you a very quick ability to say, have something new. You get something new, say a user reports a document, an invoice.doc to you, which, by the way, if a user reports an invoice.doc to you that's malicious, that's a miracle. But if they do, they send it to you, then you can take that invoice.doc and you can drop it into these Yara rules that you've been building up for years to try and determine what other invoice.docs it's like, or what other document files it's like. And then that can help you identify all these other incidents that bear some sort of similarity to that and might actually provide you some more avenues for your branching out your investigation. So the next one is parsers. So parsers basically, so English language parsing, right? There's also files. So files have different structures in them. So your EXEs, a lot of you have heard, are headers, that type of stuff. They have headers and data, executable content, everything like that. If you want to understand what's going on in each one of these sections, then you actually want to have a tool that goes and pulls these files apart. You don't necessarily want to use the tool that the exploit was written for in order to take apart that file, because that kind of opens you up to becoming exploited. So what we found is that the community actually has a number of file parsing tools out there that are very good and aren't, say, Microsoft Office or Adobe PDF Reader, but they're actually tools that were written to parse the specification for those files, and in particular look for cases where the files happen to be malformed for, say, an exploitative purpose. So I'm going to go over some right here. The middle one, actually, I'll highlight Office Parser. That was actually written by John Davison, who's sitting right dead center in the back there. So he wrote it based on, I believe, taking a weekend to read the entire Microsoft OLE specification, because that's what he likes to do in his spare time. And put together this awesome Office parser. And some of the concepts that he put into that were actually based on this other tool, PDF parser, that we had used heavily, that was written by a guy named Didier Stevens. This is generally considered to be like the go-to PDF analyzer for malicious PDFs. When we were building a system to analyze email attachments at GE, we did not have a similar tool like that for Microsoft Office files, but we had a lot of attacks coming in Microsoft Office files, which I'm sure comes as a surprise to everybody in this room. And so he put that together. One of the biggest learning points there was don't assume that the thing you need has already been invented and spend a bunch of time trying to find solutions to try and fit that. Sometimes it is beneficial to just go and write the thing yourself. So John, well, one of the reasons why I'm dancing around this slide a bit like I am will become apparent. That's been on the internet, I think open source since like 2011 or 2010 or so. This other person, whose name escapes me at the moment, wrote this program called Python OLE Tools after researching John's Office parser. And that attempts to implement some similar file carving, file parsing technology, but also goes the extra step in extracting and also analyzing your Visual Basic macros, which some of you who are in the security field today probably familiar with VBA macros, the little macros that you can actually put into your Excel sheets and your PowerPoint documents and your Word documents and all that stuff. Those things are increasingly becoming malware themselves. Like that's increasingly becoming a large amount of the malware that you see. So this guy wrote a really great analyzer called OLE VBA. So if you want to analyze PDF documents, Office documents, those three tools are really some of the, I would say, some of the most critical ones that our team uses for doing that analysis. Another one I'll throw up here that might not make sense, but it will after I talk about it a bit, is the P7zip project. And you might be confused why I throw an archive parser up here. So remember that recently Microsoft Office and OpenOffice came to a new format that's like an XML format or something like that. Basically those docx files that you see, or the pptx files, they're just zip files. And they're just zip files of a whole bunch of XML files and also a whole bunch of classic OLE format files. Also, if you put an image in there or something like that, that image is inside of the zip as a file that's zipped up. So those P7zip ends up being a free analyzer for your new Office documents. You don't need to write a new parser for that. You have one. It's your unzipper. The other thing that's nice about this tool is it pretty much unzips every single archive format under the sun. So in our case, what we do is we see a file, we throw it at P7zip. Everything goes through that. Sometimes it fails and says it can't give us any output. Most of the time it gives us some output. It'll actually extract all the sections out of an exe file. It'll do the same thing for like a Mach-O binary, stuff like that. It's a really great tool. It'll pull out some of the contents of some of the installers that you've seen, so like the Nullsoft installer, things like that. It actually understands some versions of those things as well, which is really great when you're dealing with malware that was then fed to one of those installer builders that you can get for Windows, and then the setup exe from that was shipped to you as malware. So another tool, which may also not be obvious because of its history, is this tool called EXIF tool, which is actually part of the Perl, again Perl, image EXIF tool project. So this originally was supposed to extract all the EXIF data, which is how your, say, camera, like my phone, I take a picture with my phone, it stores information about what phone took a picture and everything like that in header information in the image. This tool was originally put together to extract that information so that you could organize all your images if you want. Somebody got a keen idea to also add parsers for pretty much every single other file header out there. So now I can put a document through EXIF tool and it'll give me the author, it'll give me the original like full title of the document, it'll give me the number of pages in the document, who last saved it, stuff like that. If I give it an exe file, it'll go and pull down all the stuff that's typically in your version info tab. If you right click and go to properties in Windows, it'll give you all the version info and stuff like that too. It's pretty crazy, but it's not necessarily obviously sold like that. I recommend all these tools as really great parsers to go and install in your malware analysis environment. So the next one that's becoming increasingly helpful with the increase in, say, Java malware and C# malware, stuff like that, decompilers, or as people who aren't in the computer engineering graph up there call it, magic. So, in short, decompilers will parse like executable bytecode, and they attempt to reverse engineer it back into source code. So what you want to see is you're given a binary that's a C# executable. It will pull out all the classes, and then it will show you the classes plus the code that's in the functions or the methods in the classes, stuff like that, using the C# language or C#.NET language. Similarly, you can get Java decompilers that basically do roughly the same thing. And it's very helpful for doing malware analysis, because if you've ever had to step through pages and pages of like Java bytecode, it's extremely painful, and you might want to shoot yourself in the head or something. But if you look at Java code, it's a little bit less painful. Just slightly. So what we've seen, and typically where we focus our decompiler efforts on, is stuff that is put in .NET and Java and even Flash, and you might say Flash like movies. Well, Flash basically has compiled ActionScript programs that for the most part are about as featureful as like any Java applet or any C#.NET like formerly ActiveX control, but a plugin for your browser or something. So there's also some really good decompilers out there for ActionScript parsing, so I included it on here. You can look at a decompiler as a special class of file parser. So you're parsing binary data, and then you're trying to get the source code out of it, or you're trying to get a source code out of it that might be equivalent to it. So I'll put these up here now, and this also happens to have the same kind of pairing as the debuggers I showed to you earlier. So in these cases, there are older tools that have a lot more history to them, and therefore a lot more documentation on the internet, a lot more questions that actually are answered on Stack Overflow, things like that. So like ILSpy is a great example of that. But there are also much more powerful tools that have some promise to them. They just don't necessarily have as good documentation or a lot of familiarity in the community for things like JetBrains.peak. And actually they sell a whole suite of tools for analyzing different languages. .peak happens to be a free .NET decompiler they offer, and that is actually packaged with a larger .NET software analysis suite that they sell. Java has a program called JAD, which for years, probably more than a decade, was like the go-to Java decompiler. And it does an extremely good job unless your program happens to be compiled in a Java version, I think 6 or 7 or higher, which is nowadays most Java code is that. But JAD prior to that, and that's mainly because it's not maintained anymore, JAD prior to that did a really good job of doing decompilation and actually would run from the command line really well. So we actually still use it heavily, but we're also been investigating some other ones like the Java decompiler project that I've listed up there, which is, again, a newer one, less history to it, has a lot of promise, but doesn't have a lot of experience around it. And then finally, Flash ActionScript. This program, JPEXS decompiler, I have no idea what the first part of that name means, but basically it'll do the same thing, but it'll pull the ActionScript classes out of a Flash document. So if you have a Flash applet, or say Flash that's embedded in a Word document, or Flash that's embedded in a PDF document, which is something that is done, by the way, this thing will actually analyze that and pull out source code for you. Used to be called ASDEC. And so you can search for it under either one of those names and, and find it. So the next one, disassemblers. What I typically use disassemblers for frequently is analyzing code that was originally written in C or C++. A lot of backdoors still are written in that, especially older ones. And also a lot of obfuscation and encryption code tends to be written in those as well when attackers use them in delivering their attacks. So here are some great ones. I listed the IDA-free, IDA-Pro up here. That's actually one of the really popular ones. There's a lot of books written about that. It's been around for a really long time. there's an actual IDA Pro book that's written by, I think, like Chris Eagle, which is like the go-to book for using that tool. One of the nice things about IDA Pro that differs from, say, NDisassemble, which is if you run NDisassemble on a program, you're going to get a dump that's basically just the pages and pages and pages of disassembly, because that's how your file's organized, right? Your program is basically a linear sequence of instructions. IDA actually adds path discovery. So even though your program is just a linear sequence of instructions, when you have loops and when you have functions and everything, it's basically places where your program jumps around to different pieces of the file. So IDA Pro actually has some really great logic that will look at that disassembly listing and then will break out the different continuous pieces into blocks for you, so that you can actually see these individual blocks and navigate through the program and actually have some organization to that long listing of assembly that's typically in your big file. And then I also threw Rose Compiler up here. So IDA is not open source, but Rose Compiler for the most part is. And actually has a lot, it gives you a lot of visibility into the algorithms that are behind it. So these are the ones I've used that are helpful. Disassemblers, there is a extremely large number of these on the internet, and people have their favorites. These just happen to be a handful of mine. So debuggers, I mentioned it earlier briefly. For some reason I had it in the slide earlier, but this is a much more detailed discussion of it. When you're dealing with Windows programs, there is a Windows debugger that a lot of you are probably familiar with and have accidentally ended up in it when you wrote a program for the first time in Visual C or C++. It's okay, but these two up here, the Ollie debug and Immunity debugger I mentioned earlier, they're very geared towards malware analysis, reverse engineering use cases. And they have a lot of plugins and a lot of documentation on the internet about those particular topics. Likewise, for Linux and for Mac, as was brought up earlier, there's the GNU debugger. So that's your standard Unix debugger that's ubiquitous across pretty much any system that can have a GCC compiler these days. So if you're dealing with Mac malware, if you're dealing with Linux malware, stuff like that, GDB is a really great tool for it, and there's actually a lot of resources on the internet that talk about using GNU debugger for the malware analysis use case. I'm not personally too familiar with a lot of other debuggers for Linux that focus on malware analysis, but if anyone here has any has any ideas, let me know. And then finally, like the last category that I described in my slide earlier is what I call meta-analyzers. There's two that I use, and I'll get into those in a second. But this is kind of how I look at them, is like a huge Rube Goldberg machine of malware analysis. So they tend to be, drop one piece of malware in there, and there's maybe 20 different analysis stages that they want to run that piece of malware through. So that's kind of how I look at it. I also see them as the kind of tying things together, or the overarching tools. If you're looking to get involved in, say, some of the development around it, stuff like that, looking at one of these tools and actually extending upon it is probably, even if it's just extending it to use another tool that you didn't build yourself but you find useful into their analysis chain, like that is an extremely beneficial contribution to the community, and probably where if you wanted to jump in, that's a great place to jump in and get involved. So two of my favorites, Lycabos is a tool with a funny name, originally released by a great group of people over at Lockheed Martin CERT, and that particular tool is a huge meta-analysis framework, so it has plugins for all sorts of different analysis tools out there. It also has hooks in there that integrate with Yara at various different stages, so that you can write Yara rules not just to identify malicious behavior, but also to do file categorization and everything. With this slide, I could not begin to describe all the different features that are in it. But suffice to say, it's worth looking into, and it's relatively easy to install on a system. Likewise, Mastiff is another analysis framework, and it also comes bundled with a storage system as well, so it'll organize malware analysis for you. Written by a great malware analyst, Tyler Hudak, who's been in the industry for longer than I have, I believe. He now works for CoreLogic, put this together as a some sort of DoD research project or something like that. And he also offers a free online service. So if you're just trying to get an idea of what this thing could do for you, you can actually go to his website and upload malware samples to it and actually get some analysis outputs right there. And I have it listed up there on the first link. So that's another great tool to look into. And again, it's also very easy to get installed. Both of these are written in Python. And like I said earlier, Perl's kind of outdated. Python's kind of my language of choice now, and it seems to be generally the language of choice for a lot of the security community too. So finally, I mentioned about Mastiff doing some malware organization for you, stuff like that. I'm going to dive in like really quickly to kind of how I typically organize things, because you're not just dealing with, say, a directory to store your malware samples in. When you run it through these parsers and through these analyzers that I just talked to you about, you're also getting other outputs from those. You're getting maybe a list of the, if you ran it through exiftool, you're getting a list of all the file headers. If you had a setup.exe that you ran through P7zip, it actually pulled out maybe the DLLs and the EXEs that were inside of that setup.exe as well. You actually want to store those things somewhere so that they're collected close to the original file you got them from. So what I've been doing, mainly I look at it from the point of view of like your file system's a really good hierarchical database itself. So generally what I end up doing, again, malware zoo, term of the day, I'll have underneath malware zoo, maybe, I'll just create a new malware zoo folder, and then underneath that, every time I get a malware sample, I'll create a new folder for it. And then I'll drop it into the folder. So I'll drop a copy of the actual file in there and maybe symlink it so I can remember when I come back to this 2 years from now what I was thinking and what actually the malware sample that was in this folder was. So I use like the Linux symlinks to give me a hint there. And then for each one of these tools that I just talked about, I may create a folder for each one of them and then dump the output files from each one of those tools into this subfolder, so that now I know that if I have at this level like 2,000 malware analysis projects that I've worked on over the past 3 years, if I go into any one of them and I want to see, say, what the IDA Pro artifacts were, so I want to see what I was working on in IDA Pro in those, I can always go into the IDA Pro artifacts folder. Or if I want to see the logs from running all these files in my Cuckoo sandboxes, I actually have one folder that I've got all those put in there. Likewise, if I want to share everything I learned about artifact1.exe with Nate, because he's a friend of mine and I trust him, and he hasn't seen this file before, I can just zip up that folder and I can give it to him. And as long as I've explained this to him once, he's going to be pretty familiar with that bundle plus all the future bundles I give to him as well. So it's a pretty simple, stupid organization, but it works, and it works pretty well. And it's a lot easier to maintain on a case-by-case basis than, say, creating a SQL table for all these things to organize them, or SQLite or something like that, which aren't bad solutions by any stretch of the way. But, if it ends up being something that is a little bit of a complication to do, then it ends up being something you're more likely to skip doing when you're trying to get the job done. So here, this is an organizational approach I found is very easy for me because it's quick and dirty, which means I'm more likely to actually do it whenever I need to do it, and I'm more likely to do it repeatedly, or consistently, I should say. So, and I think that's pretty much it, but any questions? Because we have like 5 minutes left or something, 6 minutes. So, all right, everyone, thank you. Yeah. So I don't know about AWS, but I've heard of people doing it like in DigitalOcean. I imagine you can do it in AWS.
Run it in AWS.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't just because it would be expensive. But, yeah, you can tool master. The point is actually running in some cloud somewhere.